road ahead for the U.S. energy renaissance. And most of my background, as Rick talked about, has been in the international arena. And I travel a lot around the world, particularly speaking to investors, and I often get the question, which is, they're really quite amazed with what we do here. They're quite amazed with what we have built in a very short amount of time. And the question always is, how big is it? Can it keep going? Is it too late to invest? You know, what are the drivers of this industry? I would like to, based on the request from Rick and what to cover here, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we've discovered here in the U.S. in terms of the resource plays, how that fits into both the historical and the global perspective. Then maybe address some, from our perspective in the Bakken, what are some of the drivers of this industry into the future. And then, to Rick's request, talk about some of the challenges of our industry. But I guess if you put a title out there talking about the road ahead, I certainly have to show you this to warn you of the risk of forward-looking statements. So for those of you who don't know Continental Resources, we are about $33 billion enterprise value. We really grew up as a small, really a tiny independent that started in Enid, Oklahoma. We kind of grew up with the Bakken, exploring and using those technologies to try to unlock the resource that was there. But we have a very simple, straightforward strategy. We drill a lot of horizontal wells. That's about all we do. We grew up with the Bakken, as I said. Now we're about the largest producer, leaseholder, and driller in the Bakken, and have been there really since its inception. To that play, we stood back and looked, and we set a 5-year goal a year or so ago to be able to triple in terms of reserves and production from that base in the Bakken, seeing the vastness of the resource base. And most recently, we've added another oil-focused play in what we call the South Central Oklahoma Oil Province, or SCOOP, as it's known. So we have multi-decades of growth, and that is, we're very much focused on the oily part of the resource play, and we're about 68 to 70% of our production is oil and reserves as well. So in leading into the global perspective of where these resource plays sit, I think Bobby talked about this very eloquently, and I'd like to just build on some of those themes. And for those of you, I think you can see the slides from the back, but I'm sure you can't read the tiny print at the bottom which talks about the source. And clearly there's a lot of thought leaders in our industry, and I'm going to quote a lot of them, so I'll try to tell you where these slides come from, because they've done some great work. This one and the next slide actually comes from a company called Rystad, and they're energy advisors. And they've taken a look at all those resource plays, and the bullets boxes call out how many shale plays have been drilled in each of those basins. And on the left-hand scale, you can see a color coded by the geologic age or the geologic period. And so what you can immediately see from this slide, just even if you're sitting there at the back, is how small the U.S. basins really appear on a global scale in terms of the geographic distribution of those slides. Whereas you look at some other countries, a lot of those petroliferous basins, and remember now we're going for the immobile phase, we're going for the oil that's in the source rock or the surrounding intervals within them, and trying to either enhance or create permeability so we can produce those reserves. So any petroliferous basin that has good, thick shale reservoirs is clearly one that has a potential to turn into a resource play. And you can see that in many of those basins, there are millions of square kilometers of very thick shale resource type that could be a resource play. So that's the scale that the globe has to offer in terms of these unconventional shale plays in oil and gas. This is also from Rystad. Now this converts this to a little more factual. What can an investor, what is someone who's bringing time and treasure to look for these resources going to be focusing on? And Rystad does this based, the left-hand scale is certainly the recoverable commercial reserves, and then of course it's stacked up in a Pareto plot of the resource plays by country. And if you can't read that at the bottom, of course, that's the United States on the left. The colors are green and red for oil and gas. And so you can see on a commercial basis, which includes finding and development costs, geologic risk, infrastructure costs, as well as a fiscal system, you can see that the U.S. clearly offers the investment opportunity and will do for decades. All of the other plays essentially countries stack up to maybe approximate that. And then what I've superimposed on this slide is really what I call the investment fundamentals in the U.S. or the North American energy climate. It starts with that abundant resource. But abundant resource, as this slide tries to show, doesn't necessarily translate into abundant value. You need other things. You need that big infrastructure that can get it to a very, very large domestic market. You need the legal framework and the sanctity of contract to allow the investment and the capital to flow to the right resources and to the right investments. Of course, the domestic demand is huge, but as Bobby pointed out clearly, that incentivized royalty ownership is unique in the United States, and I think that is important in driving the commercial benefit, the commercial leverage that we can apply in the climate. So the climate here is clearly sets itself apart in a global perspective.